Chapter 14, Part 3 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 14, Part 3. Men were killed in the turrets by shell splinters flying through the narrow gun openings. The fire hose was repeatedly cut to ribbons, and the men fighting the fire killed. The injuries caused by near explosions were terrible. Men were literally blown to atoms, or limbs were torn off. 11 wooden boats piled up on the spar deck were a mass of roaring flame. Gun after gun was disabled, and all the while a glance at the Japanese fleet showed them steaming and firing as if at peace maneuvers, without even one of their numerous flagstaffs and signal yards shot away. The battle had not lasted an hour, and it was already evident that it could have only one ending. In the smoke and confusion Semenoff could only see what was happening in the front of the line, but the other ships were exposed to a heavy fire, and had less resisting power. The Oslabya, the fifth of the battleships, and Fölkersham's flagship during the voyage, was the first to succumb. The firing had hardly begun when a 12-inch projectile penetrated her forward above the waterline. In fine weather the effect would not have been very serious, but the heavy sea flooded her two bow compartments. Then another shell started an armor plate on the waterline amidships, flooded the bunkers on the port side, and gave her a heavy list in that direction. Unsuccessful attempts were made to right her by opening valves and admitting water on the other side. Then a shell burst in the fore turret, and put all the crews of the two guns out of action. She was now settling down by the head, and heeling over more and more to port. Suddenly the sea reached her lower gun ports and poured into her. Then, like the unfortunate Victoria, she turned turtle and sank. It was at 2:25 that she disappeared thus suddenly, the first battleship ever sunk by gunfire. 3 of the destroyers picked up some of the crew who had jumped overboard. As she sank, the 3 other ships of her division, Sissoi, Navarin, and Nakhimov, under the stress of the Japanese fire, sheered for a while out of the line with their upper works ablaze in several places. The 4 stately battleships at the head of the line had then to face the concentrated attack of the enemy. The Orel was suffering like her consorts. Though her armor was nowhere penetrated, the shells burst their way into her unarmored superstructure, and reduced everything on her upper decks to a tangled wreckage. 5 minutes after the Oslabya sank, a shell wrecked the after turret of the Suvaroff, tearing the after bridge to pieces with the flying fragments. Her steering gear was temporarily disabled, and she drifted from her station at the head of the line. One by one in quick succession the heavy steel masts and the 2 huge funnels crashed down. The upper deck was impassable from end to end. In the midst of the confused wreckage, handfuls of brave men fought the fires with buckets as they broke out now here, now there. Most of the guns were silent. She no longer looked like a ship, says a Japanese account. When the Suvaroff swerved out of the line at a few minutes before 3 o'clock, her steering gear had been disabled, and probably for a few minutes before the crisis she had not been answering her helm. The course of the fleet, while she led it during the fight with the Japanese armored fleet, had been due east, but, as she lost her direction, it turned slightly to the south. When she drifted away from the line, the Imperator Alexander III became the leading ship. Captain Buchvostoff, who commanded her, led the fleet in a circle round the disabled Suvaroff, first running southwards, increasing the distance from the enemy, and then sweeping round as if trying to break through to the northward. Togo followed on a parallel course, until the Russian fleet seemed to be going due south. Then he signaled an order, and, as accurately as if they were performing a practice evolution at maneuvers, His 12 ships turned simultaneously through half a circle, thus reversing the direction and changing the order of the fleet so that the last ship in the line became the leader. As the Russians swept round to the north, Togo was thus ready to cross their bows, and the Alexander received the concentrated fire of several ships. She turned eastwards, followed by her consorts in a straggling line, and then drifted out of her place at the head of it, leaking badly, and with her upper works ablaze. On a smoother sea the Tsarevitch had been hit once below the armour belt on 10 August. The Borodino now had the dangerous post at the head of the line. It steamed eastwards for nearly an hour, followed by Togo on a parallel course, the Japanese fire only slackening when fog and smoke obscured its targets, and the fire of the Russians dwindling minute by minute as gun position after position became untenable or guns were disabled and dismounted. Long before this, the divisions of protected cruisers under Admiral Dewa and his colleagues had worked round to the southward of the Russians. Dewa and Uriu with their swift ships were in action by a quarter to 3. The slower ships of Takeomi and the younger Togo's squadrons, united under the command of Rear Admiral Kataoka, came into the fight a little later. In the heavy sea that was running, the light cruisers afforded a less steady platform for the guns than the big armoured ships, and their fire was not so terribly destructive. But it was effective enough, and that of the Russian rear ships was hopelessly bad. The Japanese cruisers drove the transports and their escort, in a huddled crowd, northeastwards towards the main Russian fleet. The great wall sides of the German liner, now the auxiliary cruiser Ural, were riddled, and the giant began to settle down in the water. The cruiser Svietlana, hit badly in the forepart, was dangerously down by the head. The transports Kamchatka and Irtish were both set on fire, and the latter was also pierced along the waterline. She sank at 4 o'clock. The Olio and Aurora were both badly damaged, but the Japanese unarmoured cruisers did not escape scatheless. Dewa's fine cruiser, the Kasagi, was badly hit below the waterline, and was in such danger of sinking that he handed the command of his squadron over to Uriu, and, escorted by the Chitose, steamed out of the fight, steering for the Japanese coast. Togo's old ship, the famous Naniwakan, was also hit below the waterline, and had to cease firing and devote all the energy of the crew to saving the ship. At 5 o'clock the Russian fleet, battleships, cruisers, and transports, were huddled together in a confused crowd, attacked from the eastward by Togo and Kamimura with the heavy squadrons, while from the south the line of light cruisers under Uriu and Kataoka poured a crossfire into them. Away to the westward lay the disabled and burning Suvaroff, with a Russian naval flag, the blue cross of St. Andrew on a white ground, still flying from a flagstaff in the smoke. The admiral had been twice wounded, the second blow slightly fracturing his skull, and making it difficult for him to speak. Her captain, Ignatius, had been simply blown to pieces by a Japanese shell while, after being already twice wounded, he was directing a desperate effort to master the conflagration on board. The decks were strewn with dead, the mess deck full of helpless wounded men. Most of the guns were out of action, but a 6-inch quick-firer and a few lighter guns were kept in action, and drove off the first attempt of the Japanese destroyers to dash in and sink her. Still there was no thought of surrender. The few survivors of her crew fought with dogged Russian courage to the last. A torpedo destroyer, the Buini, taking terrible risks, came up to her, hung on for a few moments to her shattered side, and succeeded in getting off the wounded admiral and a few officers and men. Rojdestvensky sent a last message to Nebogotov, telling him to take over the command and try to get through with some part of the fleet to Vladivostok. About 5:30 some of the Russian ships struggled out of the press, led by the burning Borodino, with the Orel next to her. In the straggling line, battleships and cruisers, Armoured and unarmoured were mingled together. The Alexander had succeeded in stopping some of her leaks and had rejoined the line. She was near the end of it. The Ural, deserted by her crew, was drifting, till one of Togo's battleships sank her with a few shots. The Russians were now steaming northwards, and for the moment there was no large ship in front of them. The Japanese could have easily headed them off, but Togo now regarded them as a huntsman regards a herd of deer that he is driving before him. The Japanese squadron steamed after them at reduced speed, just keeping it at convenient range, the heavy ships on their right, the light squadrons behind them. At first the armoured ships concentrated their fire on the Alexander. Shells were bursting all over her and throwing up geysers of water about her bows. Then the merciless fire was turned on the Borodino. A few minutes after 7, the Alexander was seen to capsize and disappear. A quarter of an hour later there was an explosion on board of the Borodino. Next moment a patch of foam on the waves showed where she had been. About the same time, a division of torpedo boats came upon the unfortunate Suvaroff, torpedoed her, and saved some of the crew, who were found floating on the water after she sank. As the sun went down, and the twilight darkened into night, the firing died away. What was left of the Russian fleet was steaming slowly into the Sea of Japan, some of the ships isolated, others holding together in improvised divisions, all bearing terrible marks of the fight, some of them still on fire, others leaking badly. Togo had been hit during the fight, but it was only a slight bruise. The losses of his fleet had been trifling. Of the armoured ships the only one that had been badly hit was the Asama. She was struck by 3 shells aft, near the waterline. Her rudder was disabled, and she was leaking badly. She left the fighting line for a while, but was able temporarily to repair damages, and rejoined later in the day. At sunset Togo ordered his squadrons to steam northeastward during the night, and unite at sunrise at a point south of Matsushima, or Ulando Island. They were to keep away from the Russian ships in the darkness. The victorious admiral was about to let loose his torpedo flotillas to complete the destruction of the flying enemy, and meant that his torpedo officers should have no anxiety about hitting friends in the dark. He had with the main fleet 21 destroyers organized in 5 squadrons. In the bays of Tsushima, nearly 80 torpedo boats had been sheltering all day. The destroyers had been directed to pursue and attack the beaten enemy during the night. No orders had been given to the torpedo boats. The sea was going down, but it was still rough, and Togo had doubts about risking the smaller craft. But without orders, 16 groups of 4 boats each, 64 in all, got up steam and sallied out into the darkness. It was an awful night for the Russians. After dark they had extinguished the fires lighted by the enemy's shells, and in some cases got collision mats over the leaks. The dead were committed to the sea, the wounded collected and cared for. For more than an hour they were allowed to hold their course uninterrupted, and the lights of the Japanese fleet were disappearing far astern. After all, Vladivostok might be reached. But just after 8 o'clock the throb of engines, the hurtling beat of propellers, came sounding through the night from all sides. On the sea black, low objects were rushing along with foaming phosphorescent wakes trailing behind them. Bugles ran out the alarm, crews rushed to quarters, searchlights blazed out, and the small quick-firers that were still serviceable mingled their sharp ringing reports with the crackle of machine-gun fire. The sea seemed to be swarming with torpedo craft. They appeared and disappeared in the beams of the searchlights, and the surface of the water was marked with the long white ripples raised by the rush of discharged torpedoes. Loud explosions, now here, now there, told that some of them had found their target, though in the confusion and the rough sea there were more misses than hits. The Sosoi Veliki, which had been on fire in the action, and pierced below the waterline, had a new and more serious leak torn open in her stern. The rudder was damaged and 2 propeller blades torn off. but she floated till next day. Several ships received minor injuries, but kept afloat with one or more compartments flooded. But the effect of the attack was to disperse the fugitive Russians in all directions. When it began, Nebogatoff was at the head of a line of ships in the old battleship Imperator Nikolai I. In the confusion only 3 of the line kept up with him, the much battered Orel, and the Admiral Apraxin and Admiral Senyavin. The Orel had no searchlight left intact. The Nikolai and the 2 others did not switch on their searchlights, and kept all other lights shaded. The remarkable result was that as they moved northwards through the darkness they were never attacked, though more than once between 8 p.m. and midnight they saw the enemy's torpedo craft rushing past them. The ships with searchlights drew all the attacks. Admiral Enquist with his flag in the Oleg, and followed by the Aurora and Jemschug, had run in amongst the remains of the transport flotilla at the first alarm, narrowly escaping collision with them. Then he turned south in the hope of shaking the enemy off, but came upon another flotilla arriving from that direction. He had some narrow escapes. The lookouts of the Oleg counted 17 torpedoes that just missed the ship. Having got away, he tried more than once to turn back to the northward, but each time he ran in among hostile torpedo boats, and saw that beyond them were ships with searchlights working and guns in action, so he steered again south. At last he gave up the attempt and headed for the Tsushima Straits. He got safely through them, because the main Japanese fleet was miles away, steaming steadily north, with tired men sleeping by the guns. Next day he was in the open sea with no enemy in sight, and set his course for Shanghai. At midnight the defeated Russians thought they had at last shaken off the pursuit of the sea wolves. But at 2 a.m. the attacks began again. The Navarin and the Admiral Nakhimov, among the rearmost ships, were attacked by Commander Suzuki's squadron of destroyers. The Navarin was sunk after being hit by 2 torpedoes. The Nakhimov was severely damaged. About the same time the Vladimir Monomakh and the Dmitry Donskoy were torpedoed, but managed to keep afloat. The attacking force had a good many casualties. Torpedo boats numbers 35 and 65 were sunk by the Russian fire. Their crews were rescued by their consorts. 4 destroyers, the Hirosami, Akatsuki, Izazuchi, and Yugiri, and 2 torpedo boats, numbers 31 and 68, were so seriously damaged by hostile fire, or by collision in the darkness, that they were put out of action. As the dawn began to whiten the eastern sky, the torpedo flotillas drew off. At sunrise the Russian fleet was scattered far over the Sea of Japan. Some of the ships for a while steamed alone with neither consort nor enemy in sight within the circle of the horizon. But new dangers came with the day. Togo's fleet was at hand, flinging out a wide net of which the meshes were squadrons and detached cruisers to sweep the sea northwards and gather up the remnants of the defeated enemy. The weather was clearing up, and it was a fine, bright day, just the day for the work the Japanese had to do. Steaming steadily through the night, Togo, with the main body of the Japanese fleet, had passed to eastward of the scattered Russians, and was about 20 miles south of Ullondo. The distances covered in the Battle of Tsushima were beyond any that had ever been known in naval war. The running fight during the night had passed over more than 150 miles of sea. At 5:20 a.m., the admiral on board the Mikasa received a wireless message from Kataoka's cruisers reporting that they were 60 miles away to the southward of him, and that they could see several columns of black smoke on the horizon to the eastward. Shortly after, Kataoka sent another wireless message. 4 of the enemy's battleships and 2 cruisers are in sight, steering northwest. Togo at once signaled to his own ships to head off this detachment of the enemy, and sent wireless orders to Kataoka and Uryu to close in on their rear. It was probably the main fighting division left to the Russians, and would soon be surrounded by an overwhelming Japanese force. The ships sighted by the cruisers were those that Admiral Nebogatoff had led through the night, and was trying to take to Vladivostok. He had with him the battleships Nikolai I and Orel, the coast defense armourclads Admiral Apraxin and Admiral Senyavin, and the cruisers Izumrud and Svetlana. This last ship was leaking badly and down by the bows. She could not keep up with the others, and at daylight fell far astern and lost sight of them. At 7 a.m. Uriu's division in chase of Nebogatoff came up with her, and the cruisers Niitaka and Ottawa were detached to capture her. The Russian captain, Schein, had held a council with his officers. He had only 100 shells left in the magazines, and the Svietlana was being kept afloat by her steam pumps. Under the regulations he could have honourably surrendered to a superior force, but it was unanimously resolved to fight to the last shot, and then sink with colours flying. The fight lasted an hour. There were heavy losses. The Japanese fire riddled the ship, and first the starboard, then the port engine, was disabled. As the 100th shot rang out from the Svietlana's guns, Captain Schein stopped the pumps and opened the seacocks, and the ship settled down rapidly in the water. The Japanese cruisers went off to join the fleet as the Svietlana disappeared, but an armoured Japanese liner, the America Maru, stood by and picked up about 100 men. At 10:30 a.m. Nebogatoff was completely surrounded 18 miles south of the island of Takashima. The Izumrud had used her superior speed to get away to the southwest. The 4 battered ships that remained with him saw more than 20 enemies appear from all points of the compass, including Togo's battleships and heavy armoured cruisers, all as fit for work as when the first fighting began. They opened fire at long range with their heavy guns. The situation was desperate. Nebogatoff consulted his officers, and all those on board the Nikolai agreed that he must surrender. In a memorandum he subsequently wrote he pointed out that, though some ammunition was left, the Japanese were using their superior speed to keep a distance at which he could not reply effectively to their overwhelming fire. Neither the shore nor other ships were within reach. Most of the boats had been shattered. The rest could not be lowered. Even the lifebelts had been burned or used to improvise defences in the ships. Continued resistance or the act of sinking the ships would only mean the useless sacrifice of some 2,000 men. After the ships had been only a short time in action, during which time they received further severe damage, he hauled down his colours. Togo allowed the Russian officers to retain their swords, as a proof of his opinion that they had acted as befitted brave and honourable men. While the brief action with Nebogatoff's squadron was in progress, the third of the Russian coast defence battleships, the Admiral Ushakov, hove in sight. She turned off to the westward, pursued by the armoured cruisers Iwate and Yakumo. They soon overhauled her, and signalled a summons to surrender, adding that Nebogatoff had already done so. The Ushakov replied with her 9-inch guns. The cruisers sank her in an hour, and then rescued some 3/4 of her crew of 400 men. The Sissoi Valiki, badly injured in the action of the day before, and torpedoed during the night, was in a sinking condition when the sun rose on 28 May. No ships were in sight. All the boats had been destroyed, and while the pumps were still kept going, the crew was set to work to construct rafts. While this was being done with very scanty materials, the Vladimir Monomach hove in sight, accompanied by this destroyer Iromki. In reply to a signal for help, the Monomach answered that she could do nothing, as she was herself expecting to sink soon. The Iromki offered to take a few men, but the captain of the Sissoi generously refused to deprive the Monomach of her help. The 2 ships then steamed away. An hour later the Sissoi was just settling down in the water, when 3 Japanese armed merchant steamers appeared and took off her crew. At 10:30 the Sissoi heeled over to starboard and sank. Soon after she lost sight of the Sissoi, the Monomach came upon the armoured cruiser Admiral Nakhimoff, which also signalled that she was in a sinking condition. Presently there was smoke on the horizon, and then the armed steamer Sadu Maru and the Japanese destroyer Shiranui appeared. In such conditions the enemies proved a friend. The crews of the two unfortunate ships were transferred to the Sadu, which stood by till, about 10 o'clock, both the Nakhimoff and the Monomach went to the bottom. The Navarin was comparatively little injured in the battle, but was torpedoed during the night. Leaking badly, she struggled northward at a slow rate till 2 in the afternoon of the 28th, when she was found and attacked by a Japanese destroyer flotilla. She still made a fight with her lighter guns, and was hit by 2 torpedoes. The crew were all at their battle stations when she began suddenly to sink. The order, "All hands on deck," came too late, and very few lives were saved. The armoured cruiser Dmitry Donskoy, last survivor of Rojdestvensky's 14 battleships and armoured cruisers, escaped the torpedo attacks in the night and eluded pursuit all through the morning of the 28th. At 4 p.m., when she was near the island of Ullondo, she sighted some Japanese ships in the distance, Uryu's cruiser division and some destroyers. They closed slowly on her, and it was not till 6 o'clock that she was attacked by the cruisers Niitaka and Ottawa, and 3 destroyers. The Donskoy made a gallant fight for 2 hours, beating off the torpedo boats, losing 60 killed and twice as many wounded, and finally disengaging herself in the darkness about 8 o'clock. The waterline armour was intact, but one boiler was penetrated, and ammunition was nearly exhausted. In the night, the captain, who was himself slightly wounded, decided to land his men on Ullondo Island and sink the ship. All the boats had been shattered, and the cutter that was left had to be hastily repaired before it could be lowered. With the one boat the disembarkation went on slowly during the night. At dawn the enemy's torpedo boats were sighted. The rest of the crew jumped overboard and swam ashore, leaving a few men with the second in command on the ship. They ran the Donskoy out into 100 fathoms of water, opened the seacocks, embarked in their one boat, and saw their ship go down as they pulled ashore. The Japanese sent a couple of steamers to take the crew off the island. The torpedo destroyer that conveyed the wounded Admiral Rojdestvensky, Captain Semenoff, and a few other officers and men away from the fight, was found and captured by a Japanese flotilla during the afternoon of the 28th. The cruiser Izumrud, with one of the few fast ships the Russians had with them, escaped the torpedo attacks in the night. In the morning she was chased by several of the enemy's cruisers. She kept up a good speed, and one by one they abandoned the chase, the Chitose being the last to give it up. By 2 p.m. all pursuit was left behind, and she reduced speed. In the battle and the chase she had burned so much coal that she had not enough left to make for Vladivostok, so she steered for Vladimir Bay, in the Russian coast province of Siberia, north of Korea. She was off the entrance of the bay at midnight with only 10 tons of coal left in her bunkers. Unfortunately, in trying to go in the dark on the flood tide, she drove hard on a reef. Next day unsuccessful efforts were made to get his ship off, and in the afternoon, as her captain expected the enemy's ships might arrive to secure the Izumrud and refloat her, he landed his crew on Russian ground, destroyed his guns one by one with blasting charges, and then blew up the ship. The destroyer Groki was chased and captured by the Japanese destroyer Shiranui and a torpedo boat, and after a sharp fight close to Tsushima Island surrendered at 11:30 a.m. She was so injured that she sank within an hour of her capture. Admiral Enquist, with the 3 protected cruisers Oleg, Aurora, and Jemshug, had, after turning south for the last time during the night of torpedo attacks, got through the Tsushima Straits in the darkness. Next day no enemy was in sight, and she steered for Shanghai under easy steam, repairing damages on the way. She intended to lie off the port, bring a couple of colliers out of the Woosung River, fill his bunkers at sea, and try to reach Vladivostok by the Pacific and the La Pérouse Straits. On the morning of the 29th he was overtaken by the repairing ship and tug Severe, and from her learned the full extent of the disaster. Fearing that if he approached Shanghai he would be driven into the port and blockaded by the enemy, he changed his course for Manila, where he arrived on 3rd of June. The Severe, after communicating with him, had gone on to the Woosung River. She was joined on her way there by the transport Anadir, which had got successfully south through the Tsushima Straits. The transport Korea, which had escaped in the same way and had a cargo of coal, did not go to Woosung, but crossed the Indian Ocean and appeared unexpectedly in the French port of Diego Suarez in Madagascar. Of the 9 torpedo destroyers with the Russian fleet, 7 were hunted down and sunk or taken by the Japanese. The only ships of all the Russian armada that finally reached Vladivostok were the 2 destroyers Brawy and Gresny, and the small swift cruiser Almaz. She had been with Enquist's cruiser division in the first hours of the night after the battle. During the torpedo attacks she had become separated from her consorts. Escaping from the destroyers, she headed at full speed first towards the coast of Japan, then northward. At sunrise on the 28th she was well on her way and many miles northeast of Togo's fleet. Next day she reached Vladivostok with 160 tons of coal still on board. 100 years after Trafalgar, Togo had won a victory as complete and as decisive. The Russian power had been swept from the eastern seas, and the grey-haired admiral who had secured this triumph for his native land, Father Togo, as the Japanese affectionately call him, had lived through the whole evolution of the Imperial Navy, had shared in its first successes, and for years had been training it for the great struggle that was to decide who was to be master in the seas of the Far East. The war was followed by an immediate expansion of the Japanese navy. Numbers of captured Russian ships were repaired, rearmed, and placed in the Navy List under Japanese names. No longer dependent on foreign builders, the Japanese yards were kept busy turning out yet a new navy of every class, from the battleship to the torpedo boat. The laying down of the gigantic Aki and Satsuma, battleships of over 20,000 tons, opened a new period in naval construction, and nations began to count their sea power by the number of dreadnoughts afloat or on the slips. The great maritime powers are now engaged in a race of construction, and the next naval war will see forces in action far surpassing even the armadas that met at Tsushima. And maritime war, hitherto confined to the surface of the sea, will have strange auxiliaries in the submarine stealing beneath it, and the airship and aeroplane scouting in the upper air. But still, whatever new appliances, whatever means of mutual destruction science supplies, the lesson taught by the story of all naval war will remain true. Victory will depend not on elaborate mechanical structures and appliances, but on the men, and will be the reward of long training, iron discipline, calm, enduring courage, and the leadership that can inspire confidence, command self-sacrificing obedience, divine an enemy's plans, and decide swiftly and resolutely on the way in which they are to be frustrated. End of chapter 14. This is the end of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale.